All right, everybody, I'm Logan Alec, I'm a CPA, and today I'm going to talk to you about the recent increase in food prices, why it's happening, and what to expect in the future. There have been a few stories about this, and in June, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released a report saying that food prices increased by 4.8% in the 12-month period going from June 2019 to May 2020. Of course, this can be location dependent, and it also affects some foods more than others, so you may or may not have noticed it while shopping. But even though 4.8% might not sound like much, that's the difference between something costing $10 and costing $10.48. So it's still a statistically significant change, and it's going to affect a lot of people. In fact, if you look at all consumer prices for everything, the total increase was just 0.1%. So this isn't just about inflation or something like that. It's tough to make precise judgments about something like this. There are a lot of variables involved, but I want to talk about the reasons behind this increase and see if they're going to continue affect prices for the rest of the year or even into 2021. So first, I want to break down the increase in terms of how much prices change for each category. And again, this is all from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The most recent data goes up to June 2020. I'll put a link to that information in the description in case you want to look at the data yourself. Basically, it shows the monthly change for different categories starting in December 2019 and going to June 2020. They also display the overall change for the 12-month period, again ending in June. What's interesting here is that prices for all items went up by just 0.6%, while food went up by 4.5%, and food at home increased even more at 5.6%. Food away from home, which includes places like hotels, bars, restaurants, colleges, and hospitals, only went up by 3.1% over the same period of time. So even though there was an increase of food in general, it was even more specifically pronounced when it comes to groceries, food at home. And even going deeper, there are a few specific types of food that got much pricier. Beef, for example, got more than 25% more expensive over that 12-month period, while fruits and vegetables only went up by 2.5%. Now, some of these increases happened before the first coronavirus outbreaks, but the data clearly shows a significant increase starting in April. Food at home grew by 0%, 0.1%, 0.5%, and 0.5% again from December to March. Then 2.6% in April alone, followed by 1% and 0.7%. And this was a month when prices in general decreased by 0.8%. So that's a sign that outbreaks and lockdowns could be related to the recent bump in prices, and they could be having a particularly strong effect on groceries. Again, it's hard to speculate on exactly why food prices change at particular times, especially during a unique time like a pandemic with so much changing every month. Some states are shut down at certain times, others are reopening. The virus went through New York City and some other cities early on. Recently, it's been hitting more the southern and western states, and this is obviously a developing situation. But when you see such a sudden increase, it's clear that coronavirus is playing a major role here. The first thing that could account for that change is that people are staying at home, which means they're eating fewer meals at restaurants. This would also apply to students who would be eating in cafeterias. I don't want to turn this into an economics lesson, but basically what's happening is that production and distribution are based on the expectation that there will be consistent demand. So grocery stores expect to sell a certain volume of each product every month. That's how much they order. The supplier charges the market rate for that order, and they charge a markup to the consumer in order to cover wages, rent, and other expenses. Now, the problem is that when more consumers start showing up, they're going to sell those items more quickly, which means they can afford to raise prices. Of course, they'll be able to offset some of that demand by placing larger orders, but at the same time, grocery suppliers can't increase production immediately. Not all restaurant suppliers also sell to grocery stores. There have been some creative solutions. For example, some restaurant suppliers have started selling directly to consumers, but it's impossible to totally reconfigure food distribution overnight. So that means you'll start to see shortages on some products, especially with coronavirus also disrupting supply chains. And when people hear about shortages, they start stockpiling, which again makes the issue even worse. In a case like this, it wouldn't be surprising for prices to remain distorted for as long as it takes to reorient the food distribution network to a model where people are buying more groceries. Again, that's a gradual process, and I think it's one reason why the USDA expects food prices to be much more stable in 2021 once we overcome some of these challenges. On the other hand, just as coronavirus is making people buy more groceries, it's also making it more difficult to supply those groceries in some cases. There have already been several cases where meat packing plants, for example, had to shut down due to a COVID-19 outbreak. And anytime you have an increase in demand at the same time as a decrease in supply, it's inevitably going to lead lead to much higher prices. Now, with that being said, there are some less obvious factors that could be involved in the trend here. For example, seasonal labor is heavily involved in the food supply chain, and migrant workers typically make up a significant percentage of the workforce. Meanwhile, most people are understandably reluctant to take those jobs right now, and immigration has gone down substantially since the outbreak started. In fact, the U.S. issued just 48,376 visas in April compared to 424,886 in March, which works out to a decrease of almost 90%. So again, this comes down to the fact that the market has been disrupted in so many ways. Food distribution depends on seasonal workers, and it takes time to respond when the labor supply shrinks. In some cases, people have actually destroyed large quantities of food, which seems counterintuitive in times like these. You may have seen some of the stories from earlier in the pandemic where slaughterhouses culled millions of animals, and in April, the Dairy Farmers of America estimated that farmers were disposing nearly 4 million gallons of milk every day. When demand for restaurants collapsed almost overnight due to the lockdown, businesses selling perishable foods weren't always able to properly redirect their stock to grocery stores, other distributors, or even by selling directly to consumers. At the same time, food banks are struggling to meet demand. Obviously, people need the same amount of food as they did before the pandemic, but it isn't always that simple when supply chains depend on very specific processes and a relatively stable market and market conditions. And with the U.S. struggling to contain the coronavirus, it's hard to say when, if ever, those things will return to normal. Of course, some of these practices will go back to the way they were over the next months and years, but some may be very different for a very long time. In fact, Yelp data shows that most restaurant closures will be permanent, and not every restaurant is even listed on Yelp. But that indicates that this may not be about demand returning to typical levels, but rather supply shifting to match the new normal. Now, this is a complicated situation with a lot of moving parts, and as I said, I don't know what to expect for the rest of the year or into 2021. On the other hand, prices do seem to have stabilized since April, and hopefully that trend will continue over the next few months. The changes have been more significant in certain food groups, such as meat, fish, and eggs, while things like dairy, vegetables, fruits, and cereals have been much more stable. So if you're willing to buy less meat, you should be able to cut down on your grocery budget a bit. All right, folks, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. I know your time is valuable. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.